Welcome to the Master Course in High-End Blocking and Staging. Over the next 6 DVDs, our goal is to develop an all-inclusive language of camera work. In this entire course, we're blocking in 3D. 3D is really the ideal environment for experimenting with camera work because it brings a level of clarity to the blocking that we could never get from live action. And without having to wrestle with diagrams or storyboards, we immediately get to see the result of every technique. The green objects are cameras. Lock cameras simply hang in the air at lens position. Tracking and craning is shown with a rig, which we'll look at on Volume 3 and 4. In the animations, we'll see all cameras that are in a scene simultaneously, although it's rare to shoot more than 1 or 2 cameras at the same time. The camera with a green field of view is the active camera. As we cut to another camera, we're seeing that camera's field of view instead. Throughout the course, we're blocking with mannequins or models. Models are not just the most patient actors to work with, they're great for blocking because they're completely expressionless. As we work with camera moves and the body language between the characters, all emotional impact must be coming from the camera work and not from the actors. By separating the camera work from the acting performances, it becomes extremely clear how we attach thoughts and feelings to the characters and how integral camera work is to creating emotions on screen. This course is an ambitious undertaking that is created with the highest goals in mind. The course is based on the assumption that real mastery comes not from knowing a few hot moves, but from having a deep understanding of every single technique. So what we'll try to do over the next 6 volumes is break down camera work into as simple components as possible and then put it all back together. The difficulty in making a course like this is that everybody knows different techniques, so in this course we'll attempt to cover literally everything there is to know about camera work from the ground up. This means that there will undoubtedly be plenty in here you already know, especially in the beginning. When that's the case, simply take it as a refresher. The course was originally intended as simply a collection of every conceivable technique that one could watch again and again to make every technique completely automatic and second nature. Often, as soon as we're on the set, confusion takes over and the blocking becomes reduced to a series of scattered cameras that we hope to stitch together in editing. In order to avoid this blindness at the last minute, we need to not only know every technique, but to know them so well that we can use them without really thinking about it. So after watching the course, it's suggested to watch it over and over, with or without sound, to hammer in techniques until they become automatic. On Volume 1 and 2, we're dealing with stationary blocking, where we'll try to do everything we can without moving the camera. On Volume 3 and 4, we work with the moving camera and develop a comprehensive language of camera moves. On Volume 5 and 6, we develop an effective blocking method that produces excellent results for the vast majority of scenes and put everything to use by staging a lot of scenes. The ultimate goal of this course is to make directing as intuitive and playful as possible, which is ironically best achieved by having extremely strong technique, far beyond what is necessary. The purpose of this course is never to create a rigid or boring set of rules that must be followed, but to get the power that comes from knowing literally every technique in depth. The underlying assumption is that you'll take everything in here and use it how you want. With that said, let's start by running down some basics. During the next number of chapters, we'll go over some basics of composing shots. Starting with shot sizes, the various sizes go by names that are meant to make them easier to communicate. The full shot includes the feet in the frame. The medium full shot is a tighter full shot that crops around the knees. The cowboy shot is framed to include a cowboy's gun, a carryover from westerns. The medium shot cuts just below the waist. After this, we have a couple of close shots. First, the medium close shot, which cuts just above the waist. And then the close shot, which cuts by the character's breast area. Above this, we have a number of close-ups. First, the wide close-up, then the full close-up, then the medium close-up, and finally the extreme close-up. Too much credit is given to these names because they aren't exact and most people don't agree on what they mean or even use the same words. And if the character needs to move, which he usually does, the terms become meaningless. So all shot sizes are sort of. Here we're sort of in a medium close. A quicker and more precise way to communicate shot sizes is to simply walk over to the character and physically show the top and bottom of where the frame should crop. When picking shot sizes, a useful convention is to avoid cropping characters at leg joints. Here we're cutting him off at the knees, which can make him look amputated. So let's crop him in the middle of the thighs. If we need to be any wider, it's better to go to a full shot because cropping him in the middle of the calf tends to make him look like he's standing in something. And the same happens when cropping at the ankles. When we have the choice, this whole area is the least forgiving place to crop and makes sense to avoid. We simply pick shot sizes based on how identified or intimate we want to be with the character. If she's deeply personal and open about her feelings, we don't want to be this wide. And if she's talking about something ordinary, we don't want to be this close unless it has very personal meaning. Being too close can feel severe if we don't know a character because intimacy takes time. In the course of a story, we start out not knowing the characters, so in the beginning we'll lean towards full shots and medium shots, moving on to closer shots. As we gradually get to know the characters, we can better accept going closer without feeling forced. We can then save extreme close-ups for late in a story where our relationship with them has become personal. Moving out from full shots, we become less and less intimate with the character. As she gets smaller in the frame with more space around her, she begins to appear lonely or insignificant. To quickly run down the basic shot types, this is a single shot. This is a 2-shot. This is a 3-shot. And so forth. An insert is a close-up on a part of the scene. A POV, or point of view, is seeing the scene from the character's perspective. The most basic dialogue setup is 2 matching over-the-shoulder shots, and 2 matching close-ups, and all 2 cameras on each character. The technical names for these pairs are internal and external reverses, because the close-ups are inside the space between the characters, and the over-the-shoulders are outside. A normal editing pattern is to cut between the external shots, and then at some point as we get deeper into the dialogue, to move in and cut between the internal shots. If we want to become less personal again, we can go back to the external shots. We can easily have different shot sizes on each character. Here we're more identified with the woman, and less with the man. If we turn that around, we're now more identified with the man, and less with the woman. Another way to control our level of identification with the characters is with our distance to the eye line. With the camera out here, we're very far away from the eye line and more detached from the dialogue. As the camera gets closer to the eye line, we become more involved. The further we are from the eye line, the more objective and impersonal the shot is. As we get closer to the eye line, we become more involved, saving rubbing against the eye line for very personal scenes. An elegant technique can be to place close-ups closer to the eye line than over the shoulders. So starting in an over the shoulder that's further away from the eye line, as we cut close, we're also moving closer to the eye line and becoming more personal. With several cameras on a character, the shot sizes need to be different enough to avoid a jump cut. Here the cameras are too similar. As we cut from the wide camera to the closer camera, we get a jolt because the shots aren't different enough. So let's make the wide shot wider. Starting in the wider shot, the cut is smooth because we understand it as a cut. Cutting from shot sizes that are very different can also be jumpy, but doesn't come across as a mistake. Starting in a very wide shot, the cut close is startling but still makes sense visually. It's fine to place cameras on a character at different angles. But as shot sizes need to be different enough, so do angles. If we're cutting to a camera at only a slightly different angle, we get the same type of jump as before. The rule of thumb is that shot sizes or angles should be at least 20% different, but that's a little on the low end. Master shots have several meanings. The first is a wide shot that records the entire scene. So we'll start the scene in the master, then cut to the external shot on the man, the internal shot on the red woman, and the external shot on the blue woman. The women walk out, and we cut back into the master as he remains alone in the room. We can place the master anywhere we want as long as we stay on the same side of the action as the other cameras. But we have potential continuity problems cutting back into a master because the actor's performance has changed during the day, which is easier to hide in closer shots. It's also a waste of film and the actor's energy to shoot masters that we're only going to use at the beginning or end. So instead of shooting long masters, which is the convention, let's treat it as simply another wide shot and concentrate on the part we know we want to use. The second meaning of a master is a camera at a right angle to a reverse shot setup. If a POV is seeing the scene in the first person, an over the shoulder would be seeing it in the second person. A right angle master is then the third person. In editing, much of what we're doing is controlling how we're identifying with the characters. It can be very useful to have a neutral camera that detaches from them both. The third meaning of a master is a carefully choreographed camera that moves through the scene as the action envelops it. In this shot from a later chapter, we push into the scene as characters and extras weave around the camera. Here we're counting on the master being the main and perhaps only coverage for the scene. Shot size comes from either the distance between us and the characters or from the focal length. Focal length, or zoom, is the angle of view. In this oversimplified drawing, light enters the lens and is projected onto a frame of 35mm film. When we zoom in, what we're really doing is moving the lens further away from the film, which narrows the angle of view. So this is called a long lens. A wide angle is created by moving the lens closer, which widens the angle of view. So this is called a short lens. If we're fairly close to the character with a short lens, we can produce the same shot size by setting up the camera further back and using a longer lens. As we cut between these two cameras, the shot size is identical, but the perspective is very different. Focal length makes an enormous difference in the relative sizes of characters or objects. Here we're in a regular over the shoulder, but as we pull back and zoom in, the perspective becomes much flatter and the characters seem to have the same size. This is called compression of space and is as fundamental a choice as shot size. In the closer shot with a wide lens, the distance between the characters is the same as the distance from the red man to the camera. But with the camera further back and a longer lens, the distance between the characters is only a fraction of the distance to the camera. So in comparison to the distance to the camera, the distance between the characters is almost nothing. The first thing focal length does is control the closeness between the characters. This is a sliding scale. If we zoom out and move closer, the characters seem further apart. If we move far back and zoom in, the characters seem closer together. Secondly, it allows us to see the world in a different way than the human eye does. If we want a shot to look like reality, we'll use a lens that has the same angle of view as the human eye, which on 35mm film is around 50mm. But we make shots much more interesting by deliberately staying away from lenses that mimic the human eye. Here we're using a 25mm lens, which creates more distance between everything in the scene and the illusion of a larger location. Here we're using a 120mm lens, which creates a tighter atmosphere and singles out the characters we're interested in. Being wider or longer than reality is the easiest way to create production value because the image becomes an interpretation instead of a recording. Thirdly, long focal lengths suppress our understanding of the layout of the scene, which can be an effective storytelling tool. Here we're using a regular lens, and it's very easy to make out the spatial relationships between the characters. Here we're further back using a 200mm lens, which flattens the perspective and makes the layout of the scene harder to understand. This either makes the situation more disorienting, or it makes us single her out in arbitrary surroundings. Disorientation is sometimes a goal because a scene loses its mystique as soon as we know the entire layout. In choosing focal lengths for normal dialogue, a regular lens tends to create too much difference in size between the characters. If we pull back and use a longer lens, the sizes of the characters even out more, and the atmosphere becomes more intimate. So the over-the-shoulder is really out here. In close-ups, a regular lens can put us uncomfortably close to the character, and it can feel like we're shooting up her nose. So we'll again make the shot slightly longer from further back, giving us a flatter perspective and a more forgiving shot. Cutting back and forth between the two versions, the difference in perspective is very clear. This puts the close-up by the blue woman's shoulder, so we'll sometimes need to cheat her position. Cutting between cameras that have very different focal lengths usually doesn't work well. As we cut from a regular lens to a long one, the mood changes very abruptly, which is more apparent in live action than on a simple 3D set. As we pan with the characters in a very tight shot with a long lens, the cut to a regular lens seems strange because we're cutting from a compressed and intimate shot to an ordinary one. The exception to this is that shorter lenses come more naturally to wider shots because we want to capture more of the scene. And longer lenses come more naturally to closer shots because our goal is to become more involved. So going from a master that might be a 30mm to get more of the scene, the cut to an 80mm close-up doesn't feel like a sudden change in focal length because it happens for a reason. It's really not necessary to go around thinking in millimeters, except to remember that 50mm is about the same as the human eye, that higher numbers are longer and lower numbers are shorter. But it's useful to notice that the angle of view skyrockets as the lens becomes shorter, so there's an enormous difference between a 20mm lens and a 10, but almost no difference between a 190mm and a 200. In this chapter, we'll look at a couple of basic framing techniques that are worth making into a habit. The first is dividing the frame in thirds. In this external shot, there's given no priority to any character, and we're spending a good portion of the frame shooting the back of the man's head. So let's divide the frame into thirds, and give 2/3 to the woman and 1/3 to the man. We'll do the same in the matching reverse. As we cut back and forth, the character in focus has the major part of the frame. In close-up or internal shots, we'll again give 2/3 of the frame to the character in focus, but instead leave 1/3 of empty space in front. As we cut back and forth between all four cameras, the framing is balanced. Dividing the frame in thirds is a carryover from paintings and is not as much a rule as a helpful guideline to create pleasing framings. Placing characters at the center looks like a vacation photo because the only goal is to get a picture of the person. Framing in thirds, or at least placing the characters off-center, is instantly more picturesque. But since we're keeping the characters off-center, let's look a little more closely at the effect of which side of the character we put the empty space on. First of all, characters seem more open or available when they have more space in front of them. If we frame her like this instead, the frame cuts off our personal space and we're not being let in. Here the frame cuts off the man's space, so we're again not being let in. If we frame him like this instead, he might be turned away from the other character, but we're being let into his space. That's one way to look at it, but another way is to see it as if we're framing either for the shared space between the characters or for the private space behind them. Framing for the space between the characters creates intimacy. As we cut between the man and the woman, they seem normally involved with each other. If we frame for the space behind the woman, she seems to reject being part of the shared space, while the man is still part of the shared space. If we also frame him for the space behind him, they're now both rejecting being part of the shared space. Directing whether we're framing for the space inside or outside the dialogue can create very effective emotional statements. Center framing works best when a character is supposed to be head-on and own the frame. Here the man is very direct in center stage, so the most meaningful place to put him is dead center. Another good reason to place a character in the center is when he's a neutral third party. Here we're cutting between the women, and each have part of the shared space in their shot. As we cut to the man, he's equally part of both their spaces. Vertical framing for characters simply involves keeping a bit of empty space above the head. As we get closer, we'll have less space above her head than in wider shots. In close shots, it's more a matter of where to place the eyes. Here it can still work to frame in thirds, in which case we'll place her eyes on a third line. The concern is visual gravity. If we put too much space above the characters, the framing can seem too light. If we put too little space above the characters, the framing can seem too heavy. A little bit of space tends to feel at ease. Here the frame is top-heavy. By having the contents gravitate towards the bottom, we get a more relaxed and settled framing. Another factor in framing is perspective. There's lots of theory on perspective, but to make a long story short, leaning lines in the image create a sense of depth. Here the angle on the boxes causes plenty of leaning lines, both into the depth of the frame and also over on the left. If we instead move over here, we're shooting flat against the boxes, all the lines are completely horizontal, and we have no sense of depth. So shooting flat against any surface is something to avoid when we can. Lines in the image create perspective when they're moving towards a vanishing point. Here the vanishing point is inside the frame, which creates the hardest perspective. A more relaxed perspective is created by placing the vanishing point outside the frame, causing the lines to lean in that direction. So if we want to shoot a dialogue scene between these two rows of crates, this way of setting it up will give us almost no perspective. Since the cameras are not angled completely flat on the crates, we're getting a bit of perspective, but only a little bit. However, as we rotate the entire setup to get more perspective, we're running into a typical problem. One of the cameras now has more perspective, but the other one is shooting directly into the wall. In this scene, an obvious way to get perspective in both cameras is to place the characters parallel to the crates. Now we're getting perspective in both shots. Another convention from painting is that perspective lines guide the eye through the frame. Here the lines lead us towards the man. Nothing makes this clearer than placing the character dead center in the frame with all perspective lines symmetrical around him. Since photography is about forcing a three-dimensional world onto two-dimensional film, it's important that we do everything we can to retain a sense of perspective. If we take out what creates the perspective lines, we remove any sense of depth. One last consideration is where to place the horizon line, which is the ultimate vanishing point. Not all shots have a clear horizon line, so it doesn't always apply. But when there is one, the photographic convention is to place it on one of the vertical thirds, either here or here, depending on what's important in the shot.